So welcome. I'm going to talk a little bit about whiteboarding in this session. This is something that I more or less stumbled into. I had been doing sketchnoting for a long time. About 3.5, 4 years ago, I went to work on a contract as a user experience designer inside of a large insurance company. So in this insurance company, I was attached to developers, software developers that were building tools for the insurance company, who the move had been decided that they would start building their own software instead of being dependent on software they buy and then modify. Many of the problems that they encountered were when they would buy and modify software, they would modify it so much that when upgrades came, it was impossible to upgrade, and then they went through this whole terrible cycle again. So there was a shift happening towards building their own tools with more open tools, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, React, all these technical things. Anyway, that was the situation I was in. One of the things that I felt like I wanted to do was to see how sketchnoting could be helpful in this context, where I'm working with a mix of people. It could be developers who are building the software, but there's also product managers who are overseeing the whole design of the product to make sure it included all the features that they felt were valuable and that the research told them was necessary, or that in the case of this product, there was an existing product that was old and we were making a new one. So the challenge was, how do we together co-create solutions for the software? And the one thing we had in large availability were these giant whiteboards. We had whiteboards about the size of this wall, covered with whiteboard paint, a giant whiteboard. And there were whiteboards all over the place in our space, so we used them pretty regularly. But the one that we used most was this big whiteboard wall that was in the main space. There was a big table where people could sit and have a discussion. So we had this crazy idea: what if we had a session where instead of just talking about things, where typically the developers would be sitting with their laptops doing coding and not paying attention, and it felt like wasted time in some sense. What if we made this a more interactive, collaborative, co-designed space? So what we started doing was using the whiteboard as a canvas for exploring options and ideas. So what I would typically do as we started to develop the idea was, I would come into the room and the product manager or the person who was in charge of the features that were coming in the software would come to the meeting with an idea of what things do we want to talk about. So we would have a limited set of criteria. So I think it's important when you do meetings with the whiteboard is to limit what you're going to cover. So as an example, you might come in and say, our software, we need a date picker. And what I would do is I would start, a lot like in sketchnotes, I would sort of, so I'll talk a little bit more about sort of the process, then I'll show you more of the tips. So I knew that we would take photos of the sketchnotes that we were doing on the whiteboard. And we felt this was important for a couple of reasons. One is just documentation is helpful for me, because sometimes I would need to go back and figure out what it is that I was thinking at the time, deconstruct it. But it was also valuable for the rest of the team, because product managers would look at them and see what we had discussed. The developers would sometimes use them as a reference. One of the other problems was there were like 50 people on the team between product managers and developers, and there was just one of me. So I immediately had this feeling like I could become a pretty big bottleneck in the process of design. Because if there's only one me, if everyone's waiting for me to do like a mock-up or a wireframe or something, that could become an issue. So the other reason that we decided to have this session was everyone would be in the session and be present to understand what we solved together. But that the photo of the work that we did could then be used by a developer. If they were moving ahead and they had some ideas, they could take the whiteboard and build it. So what we did is we said, ideally, we would do the session, I would have time to do a mock-up, not too detailed, and then we would review it and make sure it was right, and then build it and put it into production. But if the developer was moving faster than I could produce the mock-up for it, they would actually take the whiteboard and build it and say, Mike, come here. And they would show me the work and say, this is what I see. what do you think about this idea? And then we would have a discussion in that moment to figure out how to make that work better. So this gives you some context of why the whiteboarding was developed and how it worked for us. So a couple of things that I found, this is a terrible eraser. A couple of things that I found really valuable were, because we did photographs, was of course dating it. So I would do today the 21st, right? So I might do something like this. And then, so I would sort of set left side of the screen, wherever I was going to use. And then, because the people who were bringing the features that we would help design would come to the meeting with ideas, I would make a list of the things we plan to cover. And that way we also would know which ones we did cover or didn't. So sometimes I may even do like a checkbox like this. Item 1, item 2, item 3. And then as I went along, maybe I would even use another color. So when we would talk about the item, we would check it off. And maybe if this one wasn't checked off, you would know immediately that that wasn't covered. So the other thing that I was doing is mainly, I was really doing wireframing. So wireframing is this concept of laying out the components of an interface or something so that you can understand and get a feeling for how the pieces fit together and how they might work together without getting too detailed in visual design. Like the problem is you get so deep into visual design that you may not have a good solution, and now you've committed too much effort toward making it beautiful. So wireframes are really valuable for exploring ideas without committing to them too deeply. So essentially what I was doing is wireframing in these meetings. So as an example, a typical wireframe for a meeting like this would be, I would draw some type of rectangle, because we were typically working in some kind of a screen. In the software that we did, I started to develop these patterns, and I would develop them quickly. So for example, in this case, there was always going to be a header on our software, and there was always going to be a logo here. So I would do sometimes as simple as that, some kind of a representation of the logo. So having, one of the tips I would say is really valuable is to, if you're doing this regularly, is to build a library. Okay, let's talk about having this library is helpful so that you can quickly put these things down. You don't have to think too much about what they are. So typically I would put the logo. Sometimes for typography, I would just use simple lines like this. So as an example right here, you can see there's a line with like a V, and that represents a drop-down. So if I want to have like the login, logout, it would be that simple. So some really simple objects like this. And then in this software, we had a navigation bar in this space. So we could, again, here's a chevron. The way we structured it was the chevron would bring you back and forth. Actually, it was an arrow. So in this case, let's say you're one level deep. So here we're saying this brings you back to the home page. So again, I would keep really simple symbols, chevrons like this, lines for text. Sometimes if I wanted to represent the text being larger, so this is like maybe the smallest text, I would do like a squiggle. Kind of like that. Now what we would typically do in these sessions would be, we would talk about different ways to solve the problem. So we might come to the meeting and say, I think I mentioned date picker. So let's say the first item is date picker. And the date picker is just this control that comes up and gives you the ability to choose a date and the month and the year and be able to move around. So let's say that we're going to do a date picker. What I might do is represent the screen. So maybe there's an image here, there's some text here. And then maybe our date picker would be here. So again, I had a little icon for a date picker. So it's almost like a little calendar, right? So it's a little rectangle with some dots for the dates and a little flip over, like the rings on the calendar. And then what I would often do is use another space next to it to show where it would go. So I might do something like this. Now, this is where I'll talk about another thing that I found helpful was using multiple colors. So I would typically draw the main structure in, say, a black or a dark color, and then I would do my annotations in another color, and that helped me to see where the notes were in comparison to the structure, almost like layers in a sense, without having layering ability. Another little trick that I learned is sometimes your markers can get dirty by drawing across black. They will definitely get dirty. They pick up the dry black ink, and now you have a dirty marker, and then you have to like do this to clear it away. So one of the solutions that I found was, if I knew that I was, say, going to draw something over here, I would actually put a little break in the line where I knew that I was going to cross it. And then I can do drawing right through there. And then I don't get the black ink on my marker, which was always a concern, because now I'm kind of wasting time cleaning my marker out and coming back. So what we might do here is, because this is opening on a new layer, the date picker, I can draw this separately. So typically in a session like this, we might say, idea number 1, date picker. Let's call it traditional. We might draw the whole date picker structure out. So let's say it's September. A lot of times if you go, like if you're looking for a flight or something like that, it might be September 2018. And then you might see these little chevrons, right? So you can go back and forth in the months. Occasionally you might see the date might have a drop down here, so you can pop this up. Here if I wanted to show, I could do like so, and show it pop up like this. For some reason this board is not working like I'm expecting. I use my finger a lot. I know the boards that we have, I would always end up with dirty fingers, but I also like having a little rag with me, because the rag could get under there and erase things, because I'm always like fixing little edges and stuff. So here what I might do now is, if we were talking about this traditional thing, if someone didn't know what this was, I would draw a little arrow here, and then I would leave a note, is drop down to reveal months. So maybe then we do like a little, let's say here's the 21st. So again, I would sometimes use color to help indicate. So I might not even do the numbers, right? I might just do dots for the numbers. So maybe let's assume that's a traditional. Now a developer might be sitting in the audience and say, hey, I have a really interesting idea. So I was at some airline site the other day, and they had a different way that they could do it. So he might explain it, or she might explain it, or I might offer them the pen, and then they could come up and draw the concept. Usually when they would draw the concept, I would like to leave their drawing on the board, because it felt like it was something we were creating together. But in some occasions, we would get so scribbly that I would be trying to pay attention, and then I might redraw the concept. So I might below this do so let's say the developer's name was Don. I don't know what this other concept would be. So maybe they would suggest, so maybe there's drop downs here, and I put them in maybe they're in a box, so you separate the date and the year here. Maybe it still has the back and forth. And let's say maybe the concept was to increase the size of the number so it's easier to see. Maybe it's a mobile solution, right? So the number needs to be bigger. And so maybe the solution here, I'm just making this up on the fly, is maybe you can actually scroll by touching left and right, and then the number sort of comes into view almost like in a mobile view. So we would do this. And then what I would do is try and document this information. Now, I think it's really important too that as much detail as you can provide when you're using the whiteboard is helpful, because when you look at it a month later, there might be lots of information lost. So I found that when I wrote very detailed notes around what I was drawing on the whiteboard, it always helped me later to solve the problem. Either the developer to pull that information and build it, or for me to do a mock-up from it. So I might, in this case, maybe I would give some of the rationale would be bigger number for visibility. And mobile access. Sometimes I would even leave little notes for the developer if they came in. So maybe I would say, see Dawn. And mainly I would do this because Dawn was the person who had come up with the concept, and this way they would go to the source and find out what their thinking was. Oh, okay, now I understand what you're seeing. So as much as I can document in the moment would be helpful for the future. So I'm always trying to think like, not for the moment only, but also for the future and how that would work. So the beautiful thing about this is as you start building a whiteboard, with all these notes, it starts to add up. Now, what we might do then is, let's say we had a big discussion about it, that we talked about the traditional versus the new concept. And that maybe the discussion was, we really like the traditional, but we think Dawn's is worth exploring. So we would decide. So sometimes we would even maybe have a third color. And we would do something like an icon for, we're not going to do this, maybe an X and a circle, and a checkbox for the one you're going to do. And then we could even put in things like build for so in this case, the team I was on worked in an agile methodology, so they would work in sprints. So let's say we were in sprint 1, I might write something like build for sprint 2 in another color, so it stands out a little bit, because it tells us when we need to, how we need to accelerate the work that we're doing, or maybe you could even say 2 or 3. So it sort of gives a time frame. So it sort of builds in the note that we're talking about. Something else I was going to mention, a lot of times it's really difficult to get, like if you're using markers, they lay on paper really nicely, right? You can sort of fill them in, and if you work quickly, you can do fill in like this. But it can also be tedious and it can take too much time. So one of the things that I found as a helpful tool was to get good at sort of, I guess it's cross-hatching. So you fill the space with lines like this. So it's another way that you can fill the space. It's a little bit quicker and it doesn't use as much of your ink to do this work. Sometimes there would be something I wanted to write a note about something here, but I need to put the note here. So coming back to this idea of erasing, so if I had no place to go, I might do my little breaks in a couple of places. So I would try to plan where the line would go. And let's say I was going to write a note here, I can bring it through. Okay, So, and then write another note over here. So just like with sketch noting, another thing that can be helpful is the two-line lettering method that I teach in the book is a really good way to use the marker because they dry quickly. And so normally you can do the two-line like this, and before it dries, if you fill it, it should work pretty well. So the problem with whiteboard markers, if I draw this, and I try to come back in and hit it, a lot of times it will sort of push this, and it won't actually color on top of it. These markers actually seem to work pretty well. But if this gets dry, then the ink doesn't blend together, it sort of makes a mess. So if you do solid areas, then it's helpful to be aware that it's going to be difficult. Sometimes I would even do areas like this. And then maybe I would erase a section here. So if I wanted to do so don't be afraid to use your fingers or your rag or other tools. And then you can write inside. If you do it while it's still wet, you can even clean up the edge and sort of make this a little bit clearer. I think the strange thing about whiteboard is it's just such a strange surface. It's not really paper. It's almost like you're delivering like powder in some kind of colloid form onto the thing, and then it dries, and then all that's left is the powder. It's kind of a weird, I don't know what's going on scientifically, but
it's a colloid.
Is it really?
It's a liquid with particle suspended.
So what I guess was about right.
Okay, that's right.
So this is the kind of work that I normally did. Are there any questions? I'm going to take a break and ask if there are any questions specifically about whiteboard markering that you're curious about, that you wanted me to talk a little bit about.
When you do the web training, this happen that some developers join you and maybe write on the board?
That's my goal, yes. So, from a facilitation perspective, it's great when I'm trying to draw, and I'm trying. So it's just like with sketchnoting, I'm listening to what's happening, and I'm trying to analyze what is being talked about. Where is this discussion going? Yeah, I would just do this and invite them to come up, and then they can draw on the board. And I think it was really helpful to have them drawing and expressing themselves. I know that there was another developer sometimes when I would be listening, so he would be describing, and sometimes I would just start drawing what he was thinking, but he couldn't see it. So I would be drawing this thing and would do this and such or whatever it was. And then I'd say, is this what you're talking about? I'd say, how did you read my mind, right? So again, it's not magic really, it's just we're using the sketchnoting skills that we are practicing every day to listen and then represent. Or he might say, oh no, that's pretty close, but this part over here, that's really not how it works. It actually works. He would come, then I would offer the pen. He would say, oh no, it works more like this over here, right? And then that goes to there. So then they get I try to make sure that they felt like, like when I'm drawing using some holy document, it's whiteboard, right? We can erase it. So by setting that precedent that they can draw on it and it can be imperfect, I think it was a really valuable level set for the group to know that they have the ability to modify. It's really a co-created thing, even though I'm sort of facilitating the meeting. And I'm just representing what people are saying in a visual way with some of my own thinking as well. Because as a user experience designer, I need to be guiding. So sometimes too, I might say, that's just not good practice to do that, and here's why. So it would give me an opportunity to teach, maybe even to draw, what are the problems with it? Like, as an example, on mobile devices, sometimes you open up a dialogue, and there's some sites will put the dialogue inside with the background is shaded, like this. Well, the problem is sometimes if you turn your device, then it sort of gets confused and then the dialog goes off the page and now the close is over here and you can't get to it. And then when you turn it back, then it's confused even more. And so one of the things that we made a decision about our dialog boxes was on mobile, when we would get a dialog box, it would just simply fill the whole screen. So we started to come to these agreements around what approaches that we were going to do. So this is another way to document that. So as far as the process goes, then we would take photos of what we were doing. We had a common space where we would put those images. So it was a box, but it could be SharePoint or anything. So if you're wanting to do this with your company, to have a local place everyone has access to, that worked really well. And that way, immediately after I was done, I would take a photo of the piece. So that's where the date and the time, sometimes we would put the time to. So we put the time in there. And then that also is helpful to see what items we covered and which ones we didn't. And then maybe, like before we left, we might say, next week, or maybe item 2, we say there was an item 3. We might decide we're not going to do this one. We'd mark it off, and then we would skip to this one. So in some ways, the meetings were very fluid, so based on how things were moving. So what might have happened is that maybe whatever this date picker sort of fed into the feature here. So we would jump to this because they were related to each other, and then table this one till next week because maybe the developer was not there, or there was some information we didn't have yet that we needed to do. A couple of tips about the whiteboarding. In a large corporation, I never could rely on the markers being in the room being any good. So I just abandoned that idea. I would bring my own markers along. And I was pretty protective of the markers that I carried. And then I discovered Neuland had whiteboard markers, so I started to carry those around. And it was really helpful. I would carry them on cloth because often a cloth wouldn't be available in the room either. Or maybe it's really dirty or something. So I think being prepared with the basic tools is really helpful.
There's a small thing where I've upgraded them to the big ones.
Yeah.
The refill ones, you can use the same whiteboard marker ink to refill that. And then you have, that's like whiteboarding on a whole lot of them. It's really...
So the really big square ones?
Yeah. They have transparent white ones you can buy, and then
oh yeah,
just put the marker, the whiteboard marker ink in that.
Oh,
that really
just put the ink in there. So those noisy ones sort of have the little. So you're suggesting use the clear body?
Yeah, the clear body ones, and then with the whiteboard marker ink. That is, since I started using that.
Not that way. They have something on the top of it that you fill, and that's it, putting the mark.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't put the bottle directly.
Okay, that's right. It's got like a little
Like a sandwich.
yeah, something like that, right? Let's do it that way.
And you can make your own cover from there.
That's a really great idea. And that way you know that your ink is running down, right? Right, Lawrence? Yeah, it's like if your ink is down here. So there's another trick. The other thing that I learned too is if I know I'm going to do layering like that, I might actually, if I knew what I was going to do, I might draw this part first, and then come over with the black. Because you don't see, the color gets in the black, you don't see it as much as you do the other way around. So it seemed like I was always trying to avoid like drawing the color over the black because it would contaminate my colors. And then I felt like I'm scraping, trying to get the black out of there, and it doesn't always fully come out. So some of the tricks and tips that I was trying to learn for that was that. But I think like your icon library could be really helpful. that useful reference that you have with you, and maybe it's even, maybe you start documenting it sort of like the Kalis sheets, or cheat sheets, right? Make a cheat sheet for your whiteboard sessions. And we didn't go quite that far, but that's a really interesting idea, to have a common, as you start to build these objects that everybody in the team has access to, maybe they're handed out before the session. So they can see, like, so if you're sitting in the back where you are, maybe you can just barely see what that is. And you see that icon on your sheet, oh, that means calendar, right? Whatever the.
So you mean like a translation sheet?
Yes.
From
yes.
from the icon to the meaning you do imply.
Now, usually if I do something like this, I would have some text in there, so you know, maybe the word date would be there or something. So it's usually a mix of writing. The other thing that I would do, so this is more interface design, but we would also do flow design. So a lot of times we would talk through, all right, so we're going to start at the home page. So Mark, what's the next page that we go to? Pick a name. Or maybe it goes to
Product page.
yeah, so we might show the product page, right?
Or the about page.
And then maybe on the product page, there's, you know, we would basically be doing a kind of a mind map or something. But we would sometimes even show, so that would be more of a structure. We could even show, like, I would listen while people were talking, and I might show, like, so something here opens up, and then on this one, now it fills the screen, right? Maybe it expands. And then, you know, with my colored marker, then I would be writing, you know, notes down below about the state. So trying to capture, like, a flow state. So this can be used in, I mean, we're talking a lot about interface design, but the same kind of thing can be used in different ways. I was talking with Mark yesterday, he talked a little bit about using this to do a storyboarding video. So can you tell me what we talked about yesterday?
In fact, at the same time, with the different screens, the process, I made some tutors with personnel, with action, because sometimes you have different shows, different items to select, and for each item, I propose a tutor to represent the action and what is expected for the next time, or what expects the user of the application. So at the same time, I have different, this is a framework for the application, and at the same time, for users, to be sure the client is okay with the application functionalities. Okay. Because this kind of ordering, it's more for developers, it's technical, it's not for users.
Yeah.
It's a little bit the same thing you have in Don't Make Me Think. You know this book?
Yeah.
You have the screen, you have the screens, the various pages, but you also have the mindset of the user at every level. So there are some faces of the user who is wondering what to do or looking for some hints on the page of what to do next. So you have both point of view, from the user and from the developer in the same screen. Exactly.
Maybe there, you know, I would carry around multiple colors, so maybe I would do, so the dev would have certain things I would write about,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
description. And then on this side, this is what the user is seeing.
And you have the hero story of the user. He tried to accomplish something, and he failed. He tried again. Look for different options. So you really have a story of someone.
I can write all kinds of information. Might even number, you know, 1, 2. So is anyone else here using whiteboards a little bit in your work? Are these available in your workplace? A few people? I think these concepts also work with sheets of paper. Sometimes we would be in rooms where there were no whiteboards. I think they even make these giant clean sheets of paper that you can stick on a wall and then use it like a whiteboard and then roll it up at the end of the meeting. Sometimes when we do planning sessions or planning out all the work for the next 6 weeks or something, we would stick these sheets on the board and
the difference is you are working with developers at the same pace. In my
Yes.
case, developers are external companies, and I can't have the developers in the same room. I am, so I need to make this kind of results in iPad or scan the paper and send them by email or
Yeah. So is that a co-create process though? Because what Mike's describing here has been co-creation among a number of people who are all stakeholders in
Yes.
development.
Yes.
So how do you, is yours co-creation? And if so, how do you address that with your mode?
I think it's a co-creation in two steps, or three steps. I start with a draft, I send to them, they ask a question to correct, to modify. I validate with the business. I will do a new tutor, I send to the developers, and it's iteration, it's a different step, not in the real time.
Sure.
So we kind of go back and forth. They would give comments and then you would modify it and send it back until you had an agreement. And then once you agreed, then they would start to build. Were you ever in a case where you were then sitting with the developer while they were building?
No.
So, okay, they would send you back a finished product and then you would, so it's sort of because you're remote, you bounce back and forth from developer to you. So if I mapped it out, it would be Mark here and the developer here. So it kind of go to them, they would send it back.
Exactly.
Kind of like that.
And you can add a third party, this is a business, because each time we have to validate the business.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's another.
So I'm actually interested in another aspect of the differences in the approach Mark has with yours. So you were talking about having a shared library of visual icons that can be used in this. Mark actually has to have something that they can immediately understand without having the benefit of you being in the room.
It's a lot more burden on you to do communication. Absolutely.
I have a question because you try to give the marker to people and you have a lot of people participating and drawing videos on because I try to do that. And what I have in mind, I do a lot of this kind of stuff, but on my side for people who are thinking about new project, entrepreneur and so on. And what I used to do in the past is to prototype for them what they are in their mind.
Yeah.
And we have a kind of discussion on live, we were adjusting on the iPad. And for the previous season, I did a workshop to teach them how to sketch up. So I was hoping that everyone would do at the end of the workshop, they all make their first sketch of the project. And I asked them to iterate on to update their sketch note during 5 months of their project. But nobody did that. They just went for me to
Yeah.
then because I'm kind of me and with Eric, we are the kind of sketch noter of the company. And it's very difficult for me to give the pencil to Shop to tell them that you can do it and it's not perfect, it's not perfect.
I encountered the same thing. So the challenge I had was, I think it was important that the group was not too large. So when we had the co-creation group, as the group got larger, then it was harder to maybe get through ideas as quickly. But I think also having, one of the things that we did is we dedicated all day Monday to doing this work. So we would have a session in the morning and a session in the afternoon. We would line up different topics and we would email the group and say, these are the topics if you're interested, if it's related to you. If you'd like to come, you can see it. But then the team who was working on it was the one that was required to do it. And then we would sit there and work through this concept together. But I found that it was difficult too, that people would think, I can't draw as well. In fact, the first thing they would say is, well, I can't draw as well as Mike can, but here's what I'm thinking. But I think having a small group and continually asking and providing the opportunity, a few would come up and do drawing, some more than others. There was one developer who was very active in drawing on the board his ideas, because that was a good way for him to express himself. I think the other advantage is the teams of developers all were used to using whiteboards to solve problems, so they would sit on the whiteboard and do technical stuff. I would walk by and I wouldn't know what in the world they were solving. Like, it was too technical for me to understand. I didn't know the context. But they were used to working in this way, so it was a little bit easier for them on occasion to come up. But I think, you know, the service I was providing was, I guess, really graphic facilitation just on a whiteboard, right? To some degree. So I'm listening to and analyzing and putting it together. And unless there was some disagreement or some idea that came out of the blue that maybe popped in that person's head, then they would come up. Either they would describe it or they would come up and draw the idea. And that's when I would try to hand the marker to them. And sometimes if we wanted to make it clear, I would redraw the piece just for clarity and put the notes that we talked about, because often the discussion would go beyond. But it's a really uncomfortable, in some ways, situation to co-create in this way, because you don't know what everyone's thinking. And, you know, it can be unpredictable, right? So you don't know what might come out of it. But also some of the fests. So to tell you a story, there was one product manager. She always seemed to get the most difficult things. She would always say, they always give me the hardest ones. And we would sometimes have 5 or 6 or maybe sometimes 7 sessions to solve this problem. But her tasks were always the really difficult ones. So we always said, even though it took 6 or 7 times to iterate through it, when we came out, that component was maybe the best, because we had really the chance to think of every option in every direction and find out which one really would work, because we tried every other way and it wasn't working or had issues. So in that case, it's just sometimes humor helps. So, you know, when I think I would write like session 7, and, you know, I would put the little gravestone or something like that. I would write the topic on a gravestone, and, you know, so we would have a little bit of fun with it, right? Just making it more of a group experience. So that's sort of my experience in using whiteboarding, and it seemed to work pretty well. There were always challenges, and we were trying to improve it the whole time. It got better over time. But I think it was really helpful that a lot of the success was that people felt involved and were involved in solving the problems. And it wasn't me just going away into a dark place to solve everything. And that bottleneck wasn't there. I could get ideas from other people. Because so often the developers would often what would happen would be, maybe I would come up with hey, there's a traditional way to do this. And the developer might say, well, if we do this little different thing, it would probably take 40 less hours to develop it if you would use this other drop-down or whatever the feature was. So I really liked having the developers in the room, because they would know how it would be made. So if you're able to work with, whether it's software or something else, the people that are actually doing the making of it, they have a more intimate knowledge of how things actually work together. They can tell you whether it's feasible or not. So.
I have a question. When you have finished the session, how do you retrieve the information? Because one guy is send up the information in which support, how you share the information, because okay, you are on the same page at the end of the session, but how you make a sketch note, you make a report, how you share the information.
So what I would typically do is, before the meeting would end, then I would start asking, and I'd say, okay, so we've agreed that we're going to do this nude picker, correct? And people would say yes. And Dawn, this is an idea for Dawn, so developers, if you need to talk to Dawn, that's the person. And then I would start documenting, like, are there any other things, any other problems that we foresee? Like, well, we need to check on this library. Because you think maybe somebody says, hey, there's a picker like that in another library that we can maybe start with. So I would write that, and I would try, like, while the people are still there, to write as much information and capture it. And then we would take a photograph, and then put it into, I I think for a while we had SharePoint and then we switched to Box. So
how do you translate it in technical specifications? Because
I think,
technical specifications and for developer,
Yeah.
and then technical specification with
Right.
all the steps and.
sometimes that would be me, often it would be the product person, the product manager would take the what. So what they would do is because we had a common place to put the images, they could then put a link, or they could take the image and put it into whatever tool, Jira or whatever tool they were using, and put it into the task. And then in the task, it would have all the documentation that the product person was entering over time. Like it must be this wide, it must say these things, here's the text for the error. Any of the things that are needed would be built into that task, and then the visual would be attached to it. And then maybe later, when I do a mock-up, then the link to the mock-up would be there. So a developer could then sit down and say, all right, I read the specs, and now I look at the whiteboard and understand how we came to this decision. And maybe we look at the mock-up and say, oh, now I see the button should be this tall, and this color goes here, and then they would sort of use that as a starting point. So they would have a reference. So they,
Okay, so
The whiteboard is not the specification.
no, it's
It's before.
a means to an end, yeah, in a lot of ways.
There is still work behind.
A lot of times, by the time we came to this, there would be some specifications before we came. And what was helpful for the product person who was writing the specifications is seeing the process would help them clarify what the specifications were in more detail. So they could add more detail on descriptions, because we would say, well, we're going to have a date picker, how many, how do we deal with leap year, let's say. And they would have a whole discussion about leap year, like, or sometimes just imagine. So we would talk about the whole thing, and that would lead the person writing the specifications to add that information to whatever tool they were using to document that task.
I just put it because in the past I tried to attach the picture, the photo of what I did, and send to the attendees. And to be honest, I understood it was not very good for them because okay, at the moment all the people in the room were on the same page.
Yeah.
But after that, they asked me to explain more, explain details, and okay, I remember you did this tutorial, but I forgot the reason why, and something like that. So it's very efficient in the real time with all the people in the same room, but when I don't speak about specification for developers, because I try to, as I explained more, I try to make them understand without any legend or any information. But sometimes I try to solve problems or to understand the request of business, and I use not only whiteboard but paper clip or something like that for the material I can have at this time. But most often I need to redo a sketch note on iPad or something like that to sum up the information we share at this time.
I think that would be about it. And the thing I'm drawing is like right now we're in a meeting, like everything is fresh, everybody remembers. But in 6 months, it's got a half-life, right? It sort of degrades over time by the time you get 6 months from now. So it's sort of like you have to sort of work on it maybe more like news window here, right? If you want to make it work. Because once it's down here, then you lose, then you almost have to start over again and refresh.
Did you try recording the session? Because sometimes what is spoken around the drawing doesn't work. Doesn't work?
Yes, also because when you do this kind of work, you need to make sure that people they immediately search and find what you did. Recording is sequential. Okay, I remember, just imagine this, I remember Mike saved something during that whiteboarding session, and you have to scan all the maybe 1 hour.
Yeah, I agree.
To find the point. This problem is not just if it was in my experience. I do like Mike on a daily basis. Okay, if it's just you and developers and web designers, is not a problem. Everything is clear for everybody. The only thing you have to make sure is to use the right platform to make not just to store this, but in 6 months the findability. You can't imagine to have 1,000, 2,000 of files and then looking one to one or by date. Okay, you have to tag them, you have to manage them, a good naming convention for just for the file names, and then the problem is when maybe the sales director or the CEO write to you and show me what you're doing. Okay, this makes sense for me, for developers, for the web designers, for the sales director. That is. It's okay for him to ask because he has to speak with the customer, ensuring them we are working and what's going on. And I think it's the problem Mark has when someone that do not participate in the process of doing the whiteboard ask what's that. Okay, and you have to recreate everything again and again. And for this, one of the things I do is kind of tiring and boring. When we finish the whiteboard, I sum up everything in a text file and just by point this, which is very descriptive. It's just a description of every single point, and I use a special I use hashtag, hash and this that. And they store it in the same folder in the file system with the video. Yes, with the picture of the whiteboard. In that way, if you use the same naming convention, date, we use the date, customer, project, and another thing. You have a JPEG for the whiteboard, a TXT for the description. When without putting together a system very complicated, you just use the search, Microsoft search in your file system, and you search in